I don't know if it's just me, but I have been seeing a lot of memes, hot takes, and posts in the last month or so, especially with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, that are painting vegans and veganism, or parts of the vegan movement, as extremely problematic and connecting veganism to white supremacy. Hi friends, Serena here. Welcome back to my channel. And for those of you that are new, I talk about the what, whys, and hows of veganism from someone who's been vegan since birth. So saying things like, due to the problematic nature of white veganism, or due to the inherent white supremacy in veganism, or the connection between veganism and white supremacy, or vegans that are upholding whiteness, or any of these sorts of things. I wanted to kind of respond to those, and in particular, I have chosen one series of memes that were kind of going viral in a lot of vegan groups with progressive social justice vegan advocates. And there's a lot that I do like and agree with in this post. There's also a lot that or a few things, I should say, that I disagree with or don't like the framing of. And the main reason I felt compelled to respond to this is because while I am all for vegans holding other vegans to a higher standard, I think being vegan is always better. No matter what you aren't doing right and what else you are leaving out in your veganism, being vegan is always better, period. Like, even if you are continuing to eat strawberries picked by exploited farm workers, I guarantee you that the non-vegan food system exploits both more animals and more people, whether it's the slaughterhouse workers or you're also eating strawberries picked by exploited farm workers or anything like that. When we go vegan, we are eliminating one level of exploitation. When you go vegan and then work to buy fair trade and see where your food is coming from and, focus on all of these other issues, then you're working to eliminate further exploitation. But if you are non-vegan, no matter what else you are doing, you are actively exploiting animals. So I would always prefer that someone be vegan than not. But, of course, vegans can still improve. Veganism is not the absolute end goal or the end of our journey to be ethical people and ethical consumers. So I do make an effort to buy fair trade chocolate and, coconut that doesn't come from enslaved monkeys picking your coconuts, and palm oil and all of these other things as well. I find a lot of these connections and posts about white veganism being a problem almost as though it's better to not be vegan than be a problematic white vegan or participate in a problematic system. And so I just want to say that we have a system built on a lot of exploitation, white supremacy, racism, all these things. And that does get into the vegan movement, and vegans are not eliminated or absolved of that. But veganism is not inherently any more problematic than any piece of our exploitative and harmful system. So with that, let's keep that in mind and go ahead and get into this video where I will share my thoughts on the memes that were going around titled Veganism and White Supremacy, telling you what I like about these and agree with, and what I also disagree with and why. Let's go ahead and get into it. So the meme that I actually want to respond to here is this series of memes put out by an Instagram account called Sisoy Vegan. I have no idea who they are, and I had never heard of them before I saw this meme. But the meme, basically, the first screen is white supremacy and veganism. And then the second screen goes on to say that in 2016, only 3% of Americans identified as vegan. That number jumped to 8% among Black vegans. In 2020, 19% of white people claimed to be eating less meat. That number jumped to 31% among people of color. And then the third slide is, despite the fact that the vegan movement is largely supported and advanced by people of color, mainstream veganism is overwhelmingly white and inaccessible. All too often, it is complicit in maintaining white supremacy in both our food system and the world at large. So, a lot of this I actually completely agree with. This is very true. as I keep learning and hearing about more and more, and I have a whole bunch of the African American vegan starter guides that I've been using in my activism for the last year or two, I have learned about so many more vegans of color, longtime vegans, longtime vegan doctors, vegan advocates, vegan nutritionists, and activists that I had no idea existed, that had never been speakers at conferences and events I have attended. And this is something that has really surprised me. And I'm very aware that there are many more vegans of color than the mainstream movement, than many conferences, organizations have featured, basically. And so I have missed seeing and knowing about these people. And at some of the conferences that I have attended, I have worked and continue to work very hard to try and suggest more speakers, bring more diversity to them as well. And so I think this is a pretty accurate statement so far, that mainstream veganism, as portrayed in the media, as portrayed by the movement as a whole, is very white, and something that we absolutely need to be addressing in being more inclusive and in representation within the vegan movement. The other point I want to make on this is I like the way this is stated here, where it says that they are maintaining white supremacy in our food system. And I think that's really important, because I've also seen some posts indicating that veganism somehow is inherently white supremacist or brings out extra white supremacy in people. And I don't think that's true at all. The truth is, so much about our current society today is extremely white supremacist, especially here in the United States. That is true of our food system. It is true of our environmental system. It is true of our policy. It is true of our government. Like, we have a system built on white supremacy and that maintains white supremacy. And that is true in our food system. But it is not unique and special to veganism. And so I'm very allergic, sort of, is the word I would use, and hesitant when I see people trying to paint vegans and veganism as extra bad, or as, you know, being inherently white supremacist in the way we do things, and that you know, really has to be dealt with. I don't think that's true. So I like the way this is worded, where it's that white supremacy is in our society, and of course, if we're not careful in our vegan activism, we can be implicitly maintaining and supporting a white supremacist system. All right, so then the next slide goes on to say, here are some ways that mainstream veganism continues to uphold white supremacy. The first is repackaging foods traditionally eaten by BIPOC people for centuries as new and novel: tofu, quinoa, chia, pepitas, etc. So I agree with this, and I also have a little bit of a critique of it, which is that, yes, it is true that the majority of these foods were, you know, traditionally grown and enjoyed by especially indigenous populations. But that's also true of corn and maize. That's true of rice. That's true, like, a lot of foods that vegans eat and other people eat as well that have just sort of become newly trendy have been largely produced and arose in indigenous cultures. The main thing that colonization, as I'm familiar with it, and that the white supremacy system brought actually is meat and dairy. A lot of times, white supremacy is what brought the status and the idea that meat was this good, rich person's food, and kind of helped shift people away from eating their traditional foods to a more meat and dairy heavy diet. Like, yes, quinoa shouldn't be repackaged as novel and new. However, most of the mainstream population and people eating a Western diet have not been eating quinoa, so it is novel and new. And I've also heard that it's not really clear that something being novel and new or gaining a higher price is actually bad for many of these indigenous communities. In many places, I've heard that it's actually been very helpful and brought a lot more support for that agriculture industry. The next point is driving demand for products that require violent natural resource extraction in the global south. I mean, let's be real, that capitalism, that our entire system, that our entire way of life, this iPhone that I'm holding, these all have violent resource extraction. That is not at all unique to veganism, and that's something that I honestly don't think we can even opt out of as vegans in our system. Like, yes, violent resource extraction. That is literally what our entire capitalist economic system is built on. That's what the world economy is built on. It's not that we shouldn't try and do better and make more ethical choices. We absolutely should. But this one strikes me as sort of trying to hold vegans to a little bit of a higher standard, which I think is unfair because there are plenty of regular foods. Beef, meat and dairy is a great example of this. Brazilian beef is destroying the Amazon, and it's being shipped all over the world to feed other people, especially people in America and Europe that increasingly are demanding more and more meat. So that also is driving a lot of violent resource extraction. So yeah, we need to fix that system, but I don't really see how that's a vegan problem. Okay, the next point is appropriating Black culture to sell cookbooks and recipes, i.e. Thug Kitchen. Yes, people have been talking about the problems with the Thug Kitchen cookbook and couple who wrote it for a long time, and yes, like let's celebrate people like Bryant Terry and Afro Vegan and Sweet Potato Soul. I love her YouTube channel. I've linked her below as well. People that are from the culture they're sort of talking about and sharing those foods from. Okay, gentrifying predominantly non-white communities to open white-owned and operated vegan restaurants. Okay, gentrification, huge other problem. Again, not a vegan problem, but yes, vegans can be complicit in this if we are bringing in wealthy white restaurants into a neighborhood. But again, just because, like, if gentrification is happening, I mean, to be honest, I guess I would rather a vegan restaurant be in that neighborhood than some more non-vegan ones or a rich steakhouse? I don't know. But gentrification is kind of a whole other issue going on, again, not unique to veganism. Okay, so then the last point here on, again, this is the ways that mainstream veganism continues to uphold white supremacy, is failing to speak on the mistreatment of farm workers who are largely undocumented. And yes, like that is definitely a problem in our food system. However, absolutely not specific to veganism at all. The most abused farm workers and people in the food system are these slaughterhouse workers, often undocumented immigrants working the most brutal, the most violent, the most dangerous, the most horrific jobs. Way more vegans are speaking out about that than non-vegans, and when I hear this brought up by non-vegans, it's usually sort of a gotcha, you're not fully ethical. And I love the work that Food Empowerment Project is doing to talk about these issues and bring the plight of farm workers up to address, what berries we should or shouldn't be eating, what companies we might want to try and purchase produce from or boycott. Absolutely, I think that's really important to look into. But again, vegans have already sort of taken one step to remove exploitation from the food supply, a step that non-vegans aren't taking at all. So I would rather someone be vegan and continue to eat Driscoll strawberries than be non-vegan. So that's just kind of my take. Farm workers matter. A lot of vegans I know are the people who care, and non-vegans only tend to bring this up when they're trying to bring about hypocrisy in vegans so that they don't have to go vegan themselves. The next slide here is our veganism must be anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial. And I generally agree with this, with some exceptions, which is I think vegans get held to a much higher standard than almost any other justice movement. And I think that's largely due to speciesism. So many of the comments that I have received in my life and that I have seen as a reason that people get offended by some vegan activism is because a lot of people think that animals are lesser than humans. So how dare we compare the conditions? How dare we suggest we're a similar social justice movement? How dare we, do any of that sort of stuff? And the only justification for saying that that's offensive is speciesism and that animals matter less than people. And that bothers me. I will always speak up against speciesism, period. I will also speak out against racial injustice and racism and sexism and colonialism and all these other issues as well. But there is a little bit of a double standard where I have been to environmental protests, I have been to environmental meetings and groups where people are actually serving meat and dairy products, which are directly destroying the environment and causing climate change. And very few people call them out, and it's seen as counterproductive or petty or, something like that. and there have been some concerns about the recent BLM protests for racial justice and how there might be some animal exploitation going on at some of them, whether that is the milk jugs being used for tear gas or barbecues or whatever. And while I personally have not called those things out when I'm with these communities, that's largely because I don't think it would be effective or heard, and doesn't feel like a very productive or good time to have that conversation. But I am aware of it, and I see it, and I think that is a little bit of a double standard, that vegans are expected to speak out and participate in and go to every protest for every other human rights issue, when most of the time we're not even directly harming humans. Like, if I have a vegan club or a vegan organization that doesn't join the BLM protests, I'm not actively being racist, I'm just not speaking up and supporting a movement for anti-racism, which it would be good if we did that. But when you see an environmental movement serving meat and dairy, or you see a Black Lives Matter protest that has a barbecue with pigs, being barbecued at it, those movements are not only not speaking out against speciesism, they are actually facilitating and being part of a horrific oppression and exploitation. So, I think we should be talking about these, and we should be thinking about this, and we should be working to make our vegan activism as accessible and as inclusive and as anti-oppressive as possible. But I think there's a difference between a group that is speaking out against one injustice and participating in another injustice versus a group that is speaking out against one injustice and just not speaking out against others. So I think we need to be careful and be, we should talk about these issues among vegans, absolutely. But I think it's unfair to call people essentially like bad vegans or not vegan or not doing things right just because they're speaking out against speciesism and maybe not speaking out against racism, for example. Because then many of these other movements and places I've been involved in, they are not only not speaking out against speciesism, which would be true intersectionality and anti-oppression, they are actively participating in oppression and speciesism. All right, so the next slide is white, non-black vegans, here's what you don't do. So here's the list of things you shouldn't do. 1, don't co-opt #BLM or other movements led by people of color to promote animal rights. Absolutely, I agree with that one. 2, don't compare the conditions of industrialized factory farming to slavery. Okay, this is a really long one that could be a whole video on its own. Not gonna go into that. I will just say briefly, I have mixed feelings on this one. We'll leave it at that. 3, don't claim your diet or lifestyle is cruelty-free. Okay, my thoughts on this are similar to what I said about farm workers. I mean, yes, sometimes vegans use that word in marketing or in promotional things. We say cruelty-free diet or cruelty-free food. No, nothing is cruelty-free. Again, this phone, not cruelty-free. My house, my energy, nothing is cruelty-free. But that also is kind of a minor point to me, that's semantics, that's language, when again, vegans have already opted out and are not exploiting and oppressing animals. And anyone that is not vegan is still doing that, and I'm not gonna shy away from the truth of that. So, okay, yeah, we should probably use better language, and no one's diet is cruelty-free. But we use cruelty-free, those people that have used it, and it's not a term that I personally use. Use it more in a sort of marketing and see, you're not eating a dead animal, you're not killing animals type of way. So, sure, we should improve our language, also not the biggest deal in the world to me if someone does use that term. Next point, don't demonize Black, Indigenous people of color who are not vegan while ignoring the role of Western imperialism in popularizing meat and dairy. Okay, I agree with that, and my question is so if I do recognize that Western imperialism popularized meat and dairy, then I can demonize people? It's just kind of worded weirdly to me, and I'm not for demonizing anyone, and that is never my intention with my activism or anything I do. But I'm also going to state the truth, and the truth is, no matter what your background or how oppressed you are, If you are buying meat and dairy products, you are supporting violence and exploitation. Period. Now, yes, I recognize that there are barriers and there are some systemic changes and there are subsidies and there are food deserts and there are all these other things, and we should absolutely be addressing them. And I am doing my best to support organizations and people and locally things going on in my community to address these. But that is still, it doesn't absolve the injustice that is going on. And if me pointing that out makes me demonizing people, then call me demonizing people. I don't see it that way. So then next is, don't disregard the effects of your diet and vegan food trends on the global south. Again, said this before, I don't think vegan food trends are any worse for the global south than food in general. Like, we have a hugely violent and exploitative food system, particularly meat and dairy, way more so than quinoa or avocados or any of these other foods that might be harmful. So again, not a vegan problem, and great, I recognize that vegan food is not immune. Okay, like I personally really like action things way more than recognize, don't recognize. Like, those seem kind of superficial, I guess, when it comes to injustice and change. And the last point of what not to do as a white vegan is don't go back to normal and remain complicit. Moving on, this is getting really long here. The next slide is white and non-black vegans, here is what to do. 1, acknowledge the role that Black, Indigenous people of color have had in developing your favorite foods. Again, like, I just get kind of weird when it's acknowledge or recognize. Like, that's not really an action. That's sort of semantics. That's something, doesn't really require much. So yes, I recognize that tofu is traditionally like a Japanese food. Didn't originate here. I recognize that corn, maize, is traditionally like an indigenous America's food, okay? Great, so I mean, does that like make someone not racist because they recognize that? And does it make someone racist because they don't recognize that? I just don't see how recognizing that or not actually changes behavior and improves anything. 2, recognize the disparate impact of food injustice on Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and advocate for people's right to fresh and affordable produce. 100% agree with this one. Yes, like, there are some really serious problems, systemic problems, as I've mentioned before. Not everyone has equal access to foods, especially healthy, fresh produce. And 3, call out anti-Blackness, racism, and cultural appropriation in our movement. Yes, like, we do want to call out racism, anti-Blackness, cultural appropriation. It can be a fine line to walk between appreciation and appropriation. But yes, I generally agree with that point. 4, amplify the voices of BIPOC vegans and support them financially. I'm all about amplifying voices. I have been following and learning, especially in the last 2 months, from so many more Black vegans that I hadn't heard about before. And I think that's wonderful. And we should definitely listen to a variety of voices and make the people that we listen to and follow a wider, more inclusive community, for sure. And 5, educate yourselves on the way our food systems perpetuate white supremacy. The final slide in this meme series says, as vegans, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the racism we tolerate and perpetuate in our own community. We must dismantle white supremacy in all its iterations, including in our movement and in our food systems. Yes, totally agree. White supremacy has got to go, and we do need to be aware of it. I just don't always agree with every point on how to do that and what exactly it's in, okay? So those are my thoughts on veganism and white supremacy. I hope you found something helpful in this and appreciate my thoughts. If you do, please share this video, give it a big thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe for other more nuanced takes. And if you disagree or you want to share some other information with me, please feel free to do so respectfully in the comments. Like I said, I am not perfect, and I don't want anyone to have that idea or impression. And I want to learn. I want to hear from other people, but I also want to speak my voice and speak up for animals. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all next week.